By mid-April 1945, Soviet forces had broken through German defenses on the Oder River and at the Seelow Heights, opening the path to Berlin. The city, once the proud capital of the Third Reich, now stood isolated and surrounded. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front approached from the east, while Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front advanced from the south. Together, these forces assembled approximately 2.5 million soldiers, 6,250 tanks, and 41,600 artillery pieces for the final assault. The strategic situation was hopeless for Germany. Allied forces approached from the west. Soviet armies dominated the east, and Berlin's defenders consisted largely of depleted Wehrmacht units, hastily assembled Volkssturm militia, and fanatical Hitler Youth detachments. Yet Adolf Hitler, ensconced in his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, ordered the city defended to the last man and the last bullet. 2. The encirclement of Berlin. 2.1. Closing the ring. On April 21, 1945, Soviet artillery began shelling Berlin suburbs, and the first Red Army units entered the outer districts of the city. By April 23, forces from Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Konev's First Ukrainian Front had linked up near Schonfeld airfield southeast of Berlin, completing the encirclement. Approximately 200,000 German soldiers and 2 million civilians were now trapped within the city. The speed of the encirclement exceeded even Soviet expectations. Tank formations, once freed from the constraints of the Seelow Heights, raced around Berlin's perimeter, establishing blocking positions on all major roads leading from the city. German forces attempting to break out or reinforce the garrison found themselves engaged by Soviet armor and artillery at every exit point. The encirclement isolated Berlin not just physically but psychologically. Defenders and civilians alike realized that no relief would come, no escape remained possible, and the battle's outcome was predetermined. Yet the fighting continued with desperate intensity. 2.2 German Defensive Organization. Berlin's defense had been organized into 9 defensive sectors radiating from the city center. General Helmuth Weidling commanded the overall garrison, though his authority was complicated by the presence of numerous SS units, Nazi party formations, and Volkssturm militia answering to different command structures. The defensive plan called for a layered defense utilizing Berlin's urban infrastructure. Major buildings were converted into strong points, streets were blocked with barricades and anti-tank obstacles, and the massive concrete flag towers, originally built for anti-aircraft defense, became fortress-like positions with walls up to 3 meters thick. However, German defensive preparations suffered from severe material shortages. Ammunition was scarce, fuel for vehicles nearly exhausted, and food supplies dwindling. Many defensive positions lacked adequate heavy weapons, communications equipment, or even sufficient small arms ammunition. The defenders' greatest assets were the urban terrain itself and the desperate courage of soldiers who believed they were protecting their families and homes. 3. The nature of urban combat in Berlin. 3.1 The urban battlefield. Berlin in 1945 presented a complex battlefield shaped by years of Allied bombing. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble, creating obstacles and defensive positions that favored determined defenders. The city's wide boulevards, designed for military parades, provided good routes for tanks, but exposed them to fire from buildings on both sides. The extensive subway system, sewers, and underground passages offered covered routes of movement for both attackers and defenders. The destruction from bombing had paradoxically made Berlin more defensible. Rubble-filled streets channeled attacking forces into predictable routes where German anti-tank weapons could engage Soviet armor at close range. Collapsed buildings provided ready-made fortifications requiring no construction. Cellars and basements offered protection from artillery fire, and served as staging areas for counterattacks. Soviet forces found themselves fighting in an environment fundamentally different from open field warfare. Visibility was measured in meters rather than kilometers. Artillery and air support, while still employed massively, risked hitting friendly forces or wasting ammunition on empty buildings. The battle devolved into countless small unit actions, squad against squad, building against building, floor against floor. 3.2 Soviet Urban Assault Tactics. The Red Army approached urban warfare with hard-won experience from Stalingrad, battles across Ukraine and Belarus, and the recent assault on Königsberg. Soviet commanders organized specialized assault groups for urban combat, typically consisting of 1 or 2 rifle squads, 20 to 30 men, armed with automatic weapons and grenades. Engineers with explosives and flamethrowers. 1 or 2 tanks or self-propelled guns for direct fire support. Artillery forward observers to direct supporting fires. Medics and ammunition carriers. These assault groups advanced methodically through Berlin, clearing buildings systematically. The standard procedure involved artillery bombardment of a target building, followed by infantry assault with covering fire from tanks. Engineers would blast entry points through walls or doors. Then infantry would clear the interior room by room, throwing grenades into each space before entry. Soviet doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower. When resistance was encountered in a building, the solution was typically to call for artillery or airstrikes to simply demolish the structure. This approach was brutally effective but resulted in massive destruction. Entire city blocks were reduced to rubble by concentrated artillery fire, with some buildings receiving thousands of shells in single bombardments. The use of flamethrower teams proved particularly effective in urban combat. Flamethrowers could clear rooms, bunkers, and defensive positions with terrifying efficiency, forcing defenders to abandon positions or perish. The psychological impact was enormous. German defenders frequently surrendered rather than face flamethrower attacks. 3.3 German defensive methods. German defenders employed tactics that maximized their advantages in urban terrain while compensating for their material inferiority. Small groups of soldiers, often armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, would allow Soviet tanks to approach within 30 to 50 meters before opening fire from buildings or rubble positions. At such close ranges, even heavily armored Soviet tanks could be penetrated and destroyed. Infantry defensive positions were carefully organized with interlocking fields of fire. Machine gun teams positioned in buildings could cover approaches and streets, while riflemen provided flanking fire. When Soviet forces cleared one building, defenders would withdraw to adjacent structures, forcing the attackers to repeat the process for every building. The Hitler Youth proved to be among the most fanatical defenders. Boys as young as 12 and 13, indoctrinated with Nazi ideology and told they were protecting their families from Bolshevik horrors, fought with suicidal determination. Many adults were appalled by the use of children in combat, but SS officers and Nazi Party officials enforced Hitler's orders that every male capable of bearing arms must fight. The sight of dead children in Hitler Youth uniforms became one of the battle's most disturbing features. German tactics also included improvised ambushes and surprise attacks. Small groups would infiltrate through cellars and sewers to attack Soviet positions from unexpected directions. Snipers positioned in ruins took steady tolls on Soviet infantry. At night, German raiding parties would attempt to recapture lost positions or destroy Soviet equipment. However, these tactics could only delay, not prevent, Soviet victory. The overwhelming Soviet superiority in numbers and firepower meant that every building lost, every defensive position destroyed, brought the final defeat closer. German casualties mounted steadily, ammunition stocks dwindled, and exhaustion began to overwhelm even the most determined defenders. 4. The battle for central Berlin. 4.1 Soviet advance into the city center. As Soviet forces pushed deeper into Berlin, the fighting intensified. The closer to the city center, the more determined the German resistance became. Elite SS units, concentrated near the government district, fought with professional skill and fanatical determination. The approach to the Reichstag and Reich Chancellery was defended by successive lines of fortifications, each requiring costly assaults to overcome. By April 26th, Soviet forces had reached the Landwehr Canal, which runs through central Berlin. The bridges across the canal had been prepared for demolition, and the crossings were covered by German defensive fire. Soviet engineers worked under intense fire to construct crossing points and repair damaged bridges, enabling tanks and artillery to continue the advance. The advance proceeded block by block, street by street. Soviet artillery systematically destroyed buildings suspected of harboring German defenders. The massive 203 mm howitzers and even larger siege guns were brought forward to demolish particularly stubborn strongpoints. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous roar of gunfire, explosions, collapsing buildings, and the screams of wounded soldiers and terrified civilians. For point 2, the flak towers. Among the most formidable defensive positions were Berlin's massive flak towers, enormous concrete structures originally built to house anti-aircraft guns. These towers, with walls up to 3.5 meters thick, were virtually impervious to artillery fire. The Zoo Tower, located near the Tiergarten, housed not only military defenders but also thousands of civilians seeking shelter. Soviet forces found the flak towers nearly impossible to capture by direct assault. Artillery bombardment had minimal effect on the massive structures, and infantry assaults were repulsed with heavy casualties by defenders firing from elevated positions. Soviet commanders eventually bypassed the towers, isolating them while continuing the advance toward primary objectives. The garrisons of the flak towers maintained their defense for days after the general surrender, finally capitulating only when ammunition was exhausted and further resistance clearly pointless. The Zoo Tower alone housed over 30,000 civilians during the battle, and its eventual surrender allowed these refugees to finally emerge from their underground shelter. For point 3, civilians in the battle zone. Approximately 1.5 million civilians remained in Berlin during the assault, trapped between the advancing Soviet forces and the retreating Germans. These civilians endured unimaginable conditions, sheltering in cellars and subway stations while battle raged overhead, venturing out desperately to search for food and water amid the destruction, suffering from disease, malnutrition, and trauma. The subway tunnels and stations became vast underground shelters. Thousands of Berliners huddled in darkness. Stations had no electricity or running water, sanitation facilities were overwhelmed, and medical care was nearly non-existent. The constant thunder of artillery and the vibration from explosions created a nightmarish environment. When German engineers deliberately flooded sections of the U-Bahn to slow Soviet advance, hundreds of civilians sheltering in the tunnels drowned. Soviet soldiers' treatment of German civilians varied enormously. Some showed compassion, sharing food with hungry civilians and protecting women from violence. Others committed terrible atrocities. Sexual violence was widespread. Estimates suggest between 95,000 and 130,000 women were raped in Berlin during and after the battle. The ages of victims range from young girls to elderly women. While Soviet authorities officially condemned such behavior, enforcement was minimal. Looting was common. Soviet soldiers, many from rural backgrounds who had never seen the relative affluence of even war-torn Berlin, took watches, jewelry, bicycles, and anything else portable. Some looting was officially sanctioned as trophy collection, but much was simply theft by individual soldiers. The civilian death toll was horrific. Estimates range from 92,000 to 125,000 civilian deaths in Berlin during April and May 1945 from artillery fire, aerial bombardment, disease, starvation, and suicide. Many women and entire families committed suicide rather than face Soviet occupation, influenced by Nazi propaganda about Bolshevik atrocities and by the reality of violence they witnessed. 5. The Battle for the Reichstag. 5.1. The Symbolic Importance. The Reichstag building, Germany's historic parliament, held enormous symbolic significance. Though not used as a parliament since 1933 and gutted by fire that year, the building represented German government and statehood. For Stalin and the Soviet leadership, raising the Soviet flag over the Reichstag would symbolize the final triumph over Nazism. Stalin specifically ordered the building captured and the flag planted on its roof. By April 28th, Soviet forces had battled through the government district to reach the immediate vicinity of the Reichstag. The Third Shock Army, part of Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, was assigned the mission of capturing the building. Units of the 150th Rifle Division and 171st Rifle Division would conduct the actual assault. The Reichstag was defended by approximately 1,000 German soldiers, sailors, and Volkssturm militiamen. The massive stone structure had been fortified with blocked windows and doors, created firing positions, and prepared for last-ditch defense. The defenders knew the building's symbolic importance and were determined to hold it as long as possible. 5.2. The Assault. April 29th to 30th. The assault began with preliminary attacks to clear approaches and secure the Malka Bridge over the Spree River. Soviet engineers worked under fire to construct crossing points and remove German demolition charges, enabling tanks and artillery to support the infantry assault. The Reichstag sits on the north side of Königsplatz, now Platz der Republik, an open square approximately 400 meters across. Soviet troops had crossed this open ground under fire from the Reichstag and surrounding fortified buildings. The assault commenced on the night of April 29th to 30th, with infantry advancing under cover of darkness and artillery fire. The fighting for the Reichstag was brutal and chaotic. Soviet soldiers fought their way into the building through windows and breached walls. Inside, combat raged in darkness, with both sides using grenades and automatic weapons fire. Flamethrowers cleared rooms and staircases. The building's interior, already damaged by fire and years of neglect, became a nightmarish battlefield of rubble, smoke, and close-quarters violence. German defenders conducted desperate counterattacks to throw Soviet forces out of the building. Hand-to-hand combat occurred in hallways and on staircases. Both sides took heavy casualties in the confined spaces. Slowly, through the night and into the following day, Soviet forces cleared the building floor by floor, driving defenders into smaller pockets of resistance. 5.3. The flag over the Reichstag. By the afternoon of April 30th, the same day Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker, Soviet troops had fought their way to the upper levels of the Reichstag. Multiple groups of Soviet soldiers attempted to plant flags on the building throughout the battle, with some flags being shot down by German fire or lost in the confusion. The moment that entered history occurred on May 2nd, 1945, when Sergeant Mikhail Yegorov and Sergeant Meliton Kantaria successfully raised the Soviet flag over the Reichstag. The famous photograph of this moment, taken by war photographer Yevgeny Koldyai, became one of World War II's most iconic images. The photograph was actually staged after the building's capture and was later edited to remove evidence of looting, but it powerfully captured the symbolic significance, the hammer and sickle flying over the building that had once housed German democracy, marking Nazi Germany's final defeat. The fall of the Reichstag, while not ending all fighting in Berlin, sent an unmistakable message that the battle was lost. This symbolic capture, combined with Hitler's death, shattered any remaining German hope of continuing meaningful resistance. 6. The Führer Bunker. Final days. 6.1 Hitler's underground world. As Soviet forces fought through Berlin streets, Adolf Hitler remained in the Führer Bunker, an underground complex beneath the Reich Chancellery. This bunker, protected by 4 meters of reinforced concrete and multiple meters of earth, had become Hitler's command post and ultimately his tomb. By late April, Hitler had become increasingly detached from reality. He issued orders to armies that no longer existed, planned counteroffensives with divisions that had been destroyed, and refused to accept the reality of Germany's defeat. His physical condition had deteriorated markedly. He shuffled when walking, his hands trembled constantly, and his once commanding presence had diminished to that of a prematurely aged invalid. Those remaining in the bunker with Hitler included Joseph Goebbels, his propaganda minister and most loyal follower, Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary, and a rotating cast of military officers, SS guards, and personal servants. The atmosphere was surreal. While battle raged overhead and Soviet forces closed in, life in the bunker continued with a bizarre pretense of normalcy, with formal conferences, typed orders, and bureaucratic procedures. 6.2 The Final Decision. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet forces fought for the Reichstag less than 500 meters away and artillery shells began impacting the Chancellery gardens above, Hitler prepared for the end. He had married his longtime companion Eva Braun in a brief ceremony after midnight on April 29th. He dictated his political testament, a document showing he had learned nothing from Germany's catastrophic defeat, blaming Jews, communists, and traitors for the war's outcome. After a final lunch with his secretaries and private farewells to staff, Hitler retired to his quarters with Eva Braun. Accounts from survivors indicate Hitler shot himself while Eva Braun took cyanide. The exact time is believed to have been around 3:30 p.m. on April 30th. Following Hitler's death, his body and Eva Braun's were carried to the Chancellery Garden by loyal SS men, placed in a shell crater, doused with gasoline, and burned. The cremation was incomplete due to ongoing Soviet artillery fire and limited fuel, but was sufficient to render the bodies badly charred. Soviet forces later discovered these remains and conducted investigations to confirm Hitler's death, though Soviet authorities deliberately obscured details for political reasons. 6.3 The Goebbels Family Tragedy. Joseph Goebbels, named Chancellor in Hitler's testament, had no intention of surviving his Führer. On May 1st, Goebbels and his wife Magda murdered their 6 children, 5 daughters and 1 son, aged 4 to 12, by administering morphine followed by cyanide. Magda Goebbels had determined that her children should not live in a world without National Socialism. After murdering their children, Joseph and Magda Goebbels went to the Chancellery Garden where they were killed, either by suicide or by an SS orderly they had asked to shoot them. Their bodies were partially burned, but not as thoroughly as Hitler's had been. This murder of innocent children represents one of the most disturbing aspects of Nazism's final hours. A fanaticism so complete that parents would kill their own children rather than allow them to live in a world where their ideology had been defeated. 7. The Surrender. 7.1 Weidling's Decision. With Hitler dead and the military situation hopeless, General Helmuth Weidling, commander of Berlin's garrison, faced the decision of whether to continue fighting. On May 1st, Martin Bormann attempted to negotiate a ceasefire with Soviet forces, but General Vasily Chukov demanded unconditional surrender. By May 2nd, Weidling recognized that further resistance served no purpose beyond causing additional casualties. He surrendered to Soviet forces and issued orders for all German units in Berlin to cease resistance. This order was broadcast by loudspeaker and radio throughout the city. The surrender was not instantaneous. Many German soldiers, particularly SS troops and Hitler Youth, continued fighting either because they hadn't received surrender orders, refused to acknowledge them, or feared Soviet retribution. Some fanatical defenders fought until killed or out of ammunition. The last significant resistance came from the flak tower garrisons, which maintained their defense for several days before finally capitulating. 7.2 The human cost. The Battle of Berlin exacted a terrible price from both sides. Soviet forces suffered approximately 81,000 killed and missing and 280,000 wounded during the Berlin operation. Over 700 Soviet tanks were destroyed or disabled in the street fighting. German military casualties included at least 92,000 killed and approximately 220,000 wounded. Additionally, about 22,000 to 25,000 German soldiers died by suicide during the battle. The civilian toll was horrific. Between 92,000 and 125,000 German civilians died in Berlin during April and May 1945 from bombardment, combat, disease, starvation, and suicide. Countless others were wounded or traumatized. The exact number will never be known with certainty, as record-keeping had broken down completely. The destruction of the city was nearly complete. Approximately 70% of central Berlin lay in ruins. Entire neighborhoods have been reduced to rubble by artillery fire, aerial bombardment, and the fighting itself. The city's infrastructure, water, electricity, gas, sewage, transportation, have been largely destroyed. Thousands of bodies lay buried in rubble or unburied in streets and buildings. 8. Conclusion. The end and the beginning. The assault on Berlin ended on May 2nd, 1945, with the surrender of the city's garrison. Germany itself would surrender unconditionally on May 7th to 8th, finally ending World War II in Europe. The battle for Berlin had been the final act in the most destructive war in human history. For the Soviet Union, the capture of Berlin represented the culmination of nearly 4 years of brutal warfare. Soviet soldiers had traveled from the gates of Moscow to the heart of Berlin, suffering millions of casualties along the way. The raising of the Soviet flag over the Reichstag became the defining image of Soviet victory, reproduced in countless monuments throughout the Soviet Union and symbolizing triumph over fascism. For Germany, the Battle of Berlin marked the total defeat of the Nazi regime and the end of the Third Reich. The 12 years of Nazi rule, which began with promises of national renewal, ended with the country divided, its capital in ruins, millions dead, and the German people facing occupation and an uncertain future. The assault on Berlin demonstrated the immense destructive power of modern warfare when applied to urban environments. The combination of artillery, armor, and infantry, employed with overwhelming force and minimal concern for collateral damage, could reduce a major city to rubble in a matter of weeks. The tactics developed and refined during the battle would influence urban warfare doctrine for decades to come. The battle also revealed the depths of human cruelty and courage, fanaticism and sacrifice that total war can produce. The atrocities committed by Soviet forces against German civilians, the murder of children by their own parents in the Führer bunker, the suicidal resistance of teenage soldiers indoctrinated with Nazi ideology, and the suffering of millions of civilians trapped in the combat zone all speak to the moral catastrophe that was World War II. Today, Berlin stands rebuilt as the capital of reunited Germany, a prosperous democracy and economic powerhouse. The Reichstag once again houses the German parliament. The scars of battle have largely disappeared from the physical landscape, though bullet impacts and graffiti left by Soviet soldiers are preserved in some buildings as reminders of history. Yet the memory of the Battle of Berlin endures. It serves as a reminder of the catastrophic consequences of aggressive nationalism, totalitarian ideology, and total war. The ruins and graves of Berlin in May 1945 stand as testimony to the immense cost of these mistakes, a cost measured in millions of lives, destroyed cities, and generations of trauma. The lessons of Berlin about the importance of preventing war, the costs of fanaticism, and the resilience of the human spirit remain as relevant today as they were in the spring of 1945 when the guns finally fell silent over the shattered capital of the Third Reich.